Please subscribe to me.
This case began as rumours too gruesome to be taken seriously. The criminal in this case is by far one of the most sadistic and dangerous men to ever walk the Americas. It wasn't that he took his victims' lives, it's what he did to the bodies after that makes him stand out from the rest. Meet José Gómez. José was born on the 15th of May 1957. His parents were members of the Venezuelan Liberation Forces guerrilla group living deep in the mountainous jungle. José was the third of 10 children in this impoverished family. Living so remotely meant that the family members' primary job was subsistence farmers. José grew up in a one-bedroom rural home where every set of available hands was needed to scratch out a living from the land. While other children played, he spent his days in the fields beside his parents, toiling for food. Food came only from what they could grow or manage to barter. Most nights, the family went to bed still hungry. There was no electricity, no luxury, and no comfort. Those who knew José described him as a quiet, unassuming boy who dutifully obeyed his parents. By all accounts, his parents treated him well, but poverty hung over everything. As he grew into his teens, subtle cracks in José's meek demeanour began to surface. By many accounts, he started getting into trouble, and people began to think that he was rather strange. His odd behaviour seemed petty, but looking back, it was very telling. He began stealing animals from neighbouring farms. At first, it was to satisfy his hunger, but that changed into something more sinister. On several occasions, he was seen ripping feathers from live chickens, snapping their necks, and devouring raw meat as if he could not wait for it to be cooked. It was as if he preferred it that way. His family members were disturbed by the way he would drink the blood of these animals he killed. He caught the blood in his hands as it poured out of the animal, and raised it to his lips while the animal was still twitching. Poverty may drive a person to do extreme things for nutrition, but in José's case it was not required. It was a fetish and a ritual carried out purely for his own twisted pleasure. This grotesque obsession, which surfaced in his early youth, stood in brutal contrast to the softly spoken boy the villagers all thought they knew. What he did to these animals should have been a warning sign, but it was brushed aside, another oddity in an already strange boy. But as puberty crept in, he began muttering to himself, conversations with voices that no one else could hear. His parents thought that he was possessed by evil spirits, but in reality he was experiencing a significant decline in mental health and suffering from undiagnosed paranoid schizophrenia. There was no care plan, no support. His illness was ignored and left to rot inside him. At some point in the 1980s, José left his hometown and began drifting in the neighbouring state. He was often seen around the city of San Cristobal, at the parks and in the outskirts, rummaging through trash for scraps of food and begging for money. He slept under bridges and in abandoned shacks, anywhere he could. Those who encountered José described him as a vagrant with unkempt hair and a distant glaze in his eyes. To the authorities, he was just another beggar, a homeless man on the fringe of society. But beneath the surface, José's mind was growing ever more unhinged. Very few people paid attention to his ramblings. It was only after a violent incident in the mid-1990s that José's deteriorating mental state finally caught the attention of the authorities. In 1995, an altercation involving another homeless man turned deadly. José was living under a bridge alongside fellow vagrants Baltasar Mourinho and Antonio Guerrero. One night, a fight broke out between José and Baltasar. Eventually, José got the better of Baltasar and managed to end his life, the specifics of which are poorly reported, but what is known is what José did next. José was a raw meat-eating, blood-drinking schizophrenic who had not eaten in weeks. José turned to Baltasar's corpse and began to devour it. José, gaunt and starving, crouched over the body and began to feed. With his bare hands, he tore into his dead companion. Flesh and blood consumed raw, just like the chickens he used to tear apart on the family farm. Only this wasn't livestock. This time, it was a man. It's not known if Baltasar was his first, but he was not going to be his last. The other homeless man, Antonio, wasn't there at the scene at the time, but when he came back to under the bridge, he couldn't find Baltazar anywhere, so suspicion turned towards Jose. Next, Antonio confronted Jose and asked him where Baltazar was. It was then that he saw the partially eaten flesh of Baltazar. Antonio ran to the police station and made a report instantly. But the police officers, they didn't quite believe Antonio at the time. They passed off Antonio as a rambling homeless man experiencing some kind of delusion. But eventually they were persuaded to check out the situation. When the police finally arrived at the scene, their disbelief melted into silence. They found Jose still there, surrounded by bones, blood, and the remains of what used to be Baltazar. Jose was arrested and was taken into custody. At the time, Venezuela was a country not yet saturated by violent crime, and where poverty was common, but murder was still relatively rare. The discovery of a cannibal shocked Venezuela to its very core. The press seized the story, but the punishment never matched the horror. Jose underwent a round of psychiatric evaluations, and the result was confronting. He was clearly suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, and he got his diagnosis. Under Venezuelan law, his illness rendered him not criminally responsible for the murder nor the cannibalism. With no pressure from Baltazar's family and friends to contest the ruling, he completely skipped prison. He was declared mentally unwell and was committed to a psychiatric rehabilitation institute in a small town for treatment. Jose's condition seemed to improve whilst under the influence of medication and supervision. He spent roughly 2 years at the mental hospital, where for the first time in his life he received regular meals, a bed and psychiatric care. By 1997, the doctors judged Jose stable enough to be released. Shockingly, he walked out of the institution with a bottle of antipsychotic medication and instructions to continue treatment as an outpatient, but he had no home to go to, and the system made no effort to monitor him. The Venezuelan justice system was stretched thin and ill-equipped to monitor homeless psychiatric patients, so they simply just lost track of him. By the end of the 1990s, he was living in a crude lean-to shack he cobbled together under a bridge on the outskirts of Tariba, a town just on the outside of San Cristobal. Here, he hunted animals and consumed their flesh raw, but before too long, the taste of raw animal meat was no longer enough. Jose had discovered something darker, something tastier. He was no longer hunting animals. Now, he was hunting people. Whilst he was in the psychiatric ward, he made friends with a man named Manuel. He enjoyed Manuel's company because he was incredibly nice to him. When Manuel was released from the ward and back to freedom, Jose found him and invited him to accompany him for a while. The two homeless drifters drifted along together, begging for scraps of food and money. It was after a short while, in November of 1998, that Jose had a change of heart. He thought, if Manuel was such a good person, then maybe this reflected in the taste of his meat. Jose invited Manuel over to his shack one last time, only Manuel was not greeted with friendly hospitality. There was no food, but the stove was on. At this point, Jose grabbed his long spear-headed pole, described as bamboo by some and metal by others. He then drove this straight into Manuel's chest. He stabbed him with enough force to kill him. Jose then butchered Manuel into an edible and more palatable fashion. He wasn't only feeding himself. He decided he was going to cook his best friend and share him with his fellow homeless neighbours. The neighbours were none the wiser, and they were not in a position to turn away free food. Jose made some empanadas. These recipients expressed just how delightful the meal was, like nothing they had ever eaten before. It was after this point that people in the area began to go missing. The police were inundated with missing person claims. Authorities initially treated the case as isolated crimes of opportunity. Border police told the press that they suspected narco-trafficking or gang wars. Bodies were then found along the river, leading to some believe that an obscure cult was killing people, and some believed that these were satanic rituals. But none of those theories fit neatly. There was nothing in the victims' backgrounds that suggested cult ties or gang connections. Each week without an arrest only deepened the mystery and the public's unease, as more and more people were missing. The police took each case as an isolated crime, not realizing the proximity that all these cases had to the Rio Torbs River. This river was José's stomping ground. Over the next 2 months, he reportedly killed and ate roughly 2 men a week. He would take himself down by the river, seeking his next meal. He also had a preference. Children were too pure, so they weren't making his plate. As he later mentioned, women tasted floral and fruity, so he must have eaten at least one woman. But for the most part, he deemed them as too innocent. His preference was men. But not just any men, lean and muscular men. Men who appeared not to have high cholesterol, which seemed to be oddly particular. The river was a well-known jogging spot that attracted a wide range of young athlete males. It was also the route home for some strapping labourers working on the nearby developments. One man, named Francisco Lopez, became one of José's victims. He was a labourer who hauled sand from the riverbeds as a job. José would take with him his long spear and position himself near the river's pathway. Despite his frail and small stature, he had the element of surprise. José would ambush the unexpected victims, often stabbing and gutting them with his spear or bludgeoning them with rocks. After each kill, he would drag the corpse back to his shack as a snack. He dismembered the bodies, cutting them apart with his special tools. He enjoyed most the larger muscles, and calf muscles were his favourite of all. He claimed that the organs were delicious, but required more intense seasoning, so he placed the hearts and other organs in jars of spices. He enjoyed tongue soup and would use eyes in a broth. He also favoured the abdomen for its flavours, but avoided larger men through fear of eating their high cholesterol and their fat. José claimed that men tasted like a better version of the saltiest pork. But hands and feet were bitter, and heads weren't appealing to him either, so those are the parts that remained. Around the site of the river and his shack were bones, decomposed feet and hands, and heads. That was until the early morning hours of the 12th of February 1999. On this day, some civil defence personnel made a grim find during what was meant to be a routine sweep of the area. The civil defence was a separate security force from the police. They came across the remains of 2 people. The bodies had been torn apart and dumped. The discovery jolted the authorities into action. Police and civil defence forces widened their search. What they found in the hours that followed only deepened the horror. During a search of the area, 6 more bodies emerged in the shrubbery, each one dismembered and discarded. As the search intensified, they uncovered even more body parts. Each fragment belonged to one of 6 men who had gone missing in the previous months. As word spread, panic took hold. Families who had held onto the hope now waited for news they dreaded. Then, someone in the police force remembered a man who had been found chewing on the flesh of another man. A homeless man who was locked away for cannibalism in 1995. Now, with suspicion building, investigators turned their focus towards the homeless people under the nearby bridge. The place was known as a refuge for the discarded, homeless drifters, addicts, and the forgotten. There, among the makeshift dwellings and discarded belongings, stood José's ramshackled hut. It was made from scraps of wood, plastic, and hidden in dense vegetation near the riverbank. The police decided to check José's hut, but they did not expect to discover what was inside. The macabre scene they had stumbled across would send chills down even the most seasoned detectives. They found small containers of various sizes littered in the small dwelling. Each of them was filled with human flesh marinating in strange herbs and fluids, alongside pots containing partially cooked human flesh. Further examination revealed multiple severed hands and heads hidden discreetly among mundane household objects. The crude makeshift kitchen was littered with rudimentary cooking utensils, stained darkly with charred blood from repeated use. As the officers processed the scene, José emerged from the nearby bushes, walking calmly and casually towards them. The suspect identified himself as José Gómez. His demeanour amid the horrific discoveries unnerved the police, and they quickly detained him. Without hesitation or emotion, José began confessing, unravelling a chilling narrative that detailed each step of his horrifying crimes. He explained methodically how he targeted his young, healthy victims, all of whom were men, bound with muscle, and were incredibly fit. He said he found their meat to be particularly appealing to him. And then shockingly, investigators soon realised that this gruesome spree wasn't the man's first encounter with murder or even cannibalism. The story they had recently heard of the homeless cannibal back in 1995 was in fact the man they were looking for. He was charged with the murder and cannibalization of 11 men. But many people think that this only scratched the surface. During interrogations, when asked why he resorted to such grotesque sustenance, he calmly replied that human flesh was preferable, stating matter-of-factly, "I like meat, especially human meat." Following his arrest, Venezuela's press sensationalized the story, branding José as the man-eater. Some even called him the Hannibal Lecter of the Andes. The revelation completely stunned the nation, which struggled to comprehend how such heinous acts could occur undetected for so long. Despite being in police custody, his flesh-eating days were not behind him. He still had a taste for it, and he was going to be given one last opportunity. Public outcry following the revelations was fierce, but again, the justice system was in an awkward position. In the end, the Venezuelan courts never held a conventional murder trial. Instead, José was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and was declared immutable once more. Technically, no criminal sentence or formal conviction was issued. However, the judge said he will have a never-ending sentence. José has been confined under an indefinite security measure ever since. José was placed in a detention center. However, this particular institute only had a capacity of 120 inmates, and technically, he wasn't a criminal prisoner. He was in a very grey area of the law. In 2002, the judge arranged for him to be moved to a state psychiatric sanatorium. This was called Babula. However, this facility refused him as he was deemed just too dangerous, and so he was returned to the detention center. As time went on, José had several review hearings, and each time his indefinite detention was upheld, and for good reason. He still had more cannibalism left inside him. In the final days of September 2016, violence erupted inside the prison that he was held in. The facility was notorious for overcrowding and neglect. What began as a protest spiraled into a month-long siege. Armed inmates took control of the prison, seizing hostages that included officers and visiting relatives. As days turned into weeks, the captors released horrifying videos. One showed a man's fingers being severed, but then whispers spread that some prisoners had been killed, and worse. By early October, 2 inmates were confirmed dead. They were identified as Anthony Correa and Juan Herrera. Both men were young and were from working-class families. According to relatives, they had been jailed for robbery. Juan's father told reporters that his son had begged to be transferred before the prison riot broke out, but he never made it out. Over the course of the riots, news got out that some inmates had resorted to cannibalism, but these were only rumours. According to survivors, Juan was stabbed and strung up by 40 inmates part of the prison gang. He was left hanging to bleed out. Then, his body was carved into small pieces. Some parts were boiled, others were grilled. The meat was served to other prisoners. The butcher, distributor, and consumer was none other than the man-eater himself, José. It's suspected that José dismembered and distributed the meat of 3 men during the prison uprising. The families of these victims were told that they had been murdered, but they never spoke about the rumours of cannibalism. 6 police officers were arrested for allegedly aiding or allowing the violence to continue. But when pressed about the allegations of cannibalism, the Prime Minister dismissed them, saying nothing could be proven without scientific evidence. Meanwhile, lawyers claimed to have video proof of the cannibalism and demanded a full investigation. but the families got nothing but silence. Juan's father said that he had to borrow money just to bribe officials for scraps of information. Months passed, but forensic results never came. By 2018, he was still waiting for answers, and still waking up from nightmares about what happened to his son. He had no body, no death certificate, only words from other prisoners. Jose, despite being named repeatedly, has not faced trial for what happened during those blood-soaked weeks. Authorities remain mute, and their families continue to demand justice. In 2024, a non-governmental organization reported that Jose is now 67 years old and has spent 25 years in custody without a trial or sentencing. He receives medication, does light chores in his cell block, and has never been recorded engaging in violence during detention. Human rights monitors say that his case reflects a troubling legal uncertainty. He remains detained under what is described as a security measure, though there is no clear timeline or formal conclusion. Some argue that despite the concerns, his continued detention has made the world a safer place to live in.